Arabian Nights is the first ever Magic the Gathering expansion set, released in December 1993, and its design and development were quite a bit different than how it works today. Obviously, we learn over time, and the mistakes of yesterday lead to the innovations of tomorrow, but from what I've seen of the online discourse, Arabian Nights, and especially Shahrazad, are often dunked on for what I'll generously call design missteps. But a lot of the facts around why this card exists, and why they almost put pink backs on these cards, and many other strange decisions, seems to have faded from the public eye. That makes sense, since all this happened 30 years ago. However, I'm here to pull back the shroud, if you will, and explain why Shahrazad is actually one of the coolest and most flavorful designs of all time. And why it's also probably the single largest atrocity in game design history. Like in any game ever. This thing should not be a feature of your game. But it is very cool. So, let's talk about Shahrazad. For 2 white mana at sorcery speed, players must leave game in progress as it is and use the cards left in their libraries as decks with which to play a subgame of Magic. When subgame is over, players shuffle these cards, return them to libraries, and resume game in progress, with any loser of subgame having his or her remaining life points rounding down. Effects that prevent damage may not be used to counter this loss of life. The subgame has no ante, using less than 40 cards may be necessary. So that's an insane text box, and this card is an excellent warning to the dangers of top-down design. Not to say top-down is a bad way to design game pieces, just that there are dangers and potential missteps. Resetting a game state has proven to be a tricky thing to balance properly in a number of games. Effects like this will slow down the game, which can be problematic from a competitive side because slowing down games has a negative impact on tournaments, but also on the casual side by simply being miserable to play with or against. From a personal antidote, I've heard many people complain that these type of effects can often nullify the game state, removing agency and making players feel like their choices didn't matter. Regardless of how you play and what you think, I think we can all at least agree this card is a logistical nightmare. It's also potentially powerful in all the ways that are incredibly toxic. I'll read Richard Garfield's words on Shahrazad, as he puts it better than I could. A few months after publication, it was pointed out that Shahrazad was potentially part of a hugely annoying and effective deck that included all planes, or better Mox Pearls, and Shahrazads. In those days, there were no deck size or card frequency limits. Maybe you play with 80 of them. Anyway, shortly into each game, Shahrazad is played, and you begin a subgame. Let's call the initial game G0, the first subgame G1, and so forth. This continues until your opponent is decked in, say, G7, from his inability to draw an opening hand. Remember, your initial deck is at least twice the size of his. Then, in G6, his or her life is halved. Play another Shahrazad and begin a new game, call it G77. Again, the opponent's life is halved from decking, and so forth. Then, in G77,777, which is lost once again due to decking, your opponent is finally reduced to 0 life. So you go back to G5, and soon begin G66. Anyway, after about 5 to the 7th power games, you will be victorious. I guess it says a lot about me that I think that is cool. I also think that's really cool, but I think we can all agree that waiting for the semifinalists to finish resolving 77,777 subgames before moving on with the tournament is probably not great for the competitive health of your game. It's also probably not great from the casual side of the game either. While I can see this being an absolute blast in certain kitchen table matchups, logistically it's just easy to abuse, and even when you're not abusing it, its novelty wears off pretty quickly in my opinion. But from a flavor perspective, this card is awesome. Its mechanics tie directly into the story it's trying to tell. In case you aren't familiar with the Book of 1001 Nights, it's a collection of Middle Eastern folktales. These folktales are told through a nesting doll-like structure that acts as a story within a story. Shahrazad is the main storyteller that uses compelling stories to keep herself alive. Her life is under constant threat from her husband, King Shahrazad, who has been taking a new wife every night, then executing her the following morning before she has a chance to betray him after he caught his first wife cheating on him. It's pretty dark stuff, but since we're just talking about Magic the Gathering, we won't get into the story too much. We don't need to know much more about the story to understand this card anyway. Shahrazad takes the game you're playing and pauses it to play another game. In the same way, the character Shahrazad takes the story you're reading and pauses it to tell another story. It's a smash hit in the flavor department if you ask me, and it's also like the only super interesting card White got in Arabian Nights. It is a bit of a shame that this card is so unfun and tedious because it's such a cool idea. I want it to be fun to play with. Unfortunately, it's not, but this is far from the only issue that Arabian Nights had. For one, the set was designed entirely by Richard Garfield and has a relatively short development cycle. It was determined that they needed to print an expansion as soon as possible, so Richard got to work making an expansion as quickly as he could. This was further exasperated by the fact that Arabian Nights' entire development cycle involved showing the card file to Joel Mick and Skaff Elias for a week. There was no real playtesting, and while there were critiques of certain cards, they all came in the form of a few emails. Many of these critiques would go unheeded according to an article written by Skaff Elias, and the reason for that is that there was no actual data due to a lack of playtesting. What I found particularly interesting in Skaff's article is that he didn't even mention Shahrazad at all, and his article was mostly about problematic card designs. However, that's a story for another time, so let us turn our attention back to the very rushed design of Arabian Nights. In fact, that's why Richard used the Arabian Nights setting at all. He felt he didn't have enough time to craft a story or a compelling world, so he decided to borrow one so that he could instead focus entirely on the mechanics and converting concepts from the stories into cards. It's easy to make mistakes when you're doing something new and opinions differ internally. One of the biggest decisions of Arabian Nights was the debate on whether or not to use the same card back that ABU used. Arabian Nights was originally slated to feature its card back with pink and yellow instead of the brown and blue of the original cards. This is one of those ideas that I often see clowned on as being a terrible idea with no upside, but I don't believe that to be true. In fact, I'm not even sure it was the right decision to use the same card back for all sets. But that's impossible to know since we only have the reality we are in, which has the same card back for all sets. But before you call me stupid, give me the chance to let Garfield explain his reasoning. Before we can talk about how Arabian Nights was made, we have to talk about how I saw Magic at the time. The intent was to print Magic the Gathering only once, and that when we started to run out of the Gathering, we would print Magic the Gathering Ice Age, sort of a second Magic edition. Ice Age would have its own card back, and people would play it by itself, though mechanically they could mix it with the Gathering. There were many reasons why I viewed the game this way rather than the way we ended up making Magic. The problems associated with playtesting a game that is constantly growing are obvious. Each added card has to be tested against all the previously printed cards, and so the complexity of the game testing mounts. Also, being pressured to come up with new card mechanics could eventually only lead to more complex mechanics. It would be much safer to sell new environments, new combinations of mostly understood cards, than entirely new card sets. Besides, this method was closer to that employed by board and card games, a model that was better understood. So I was worried in the summer of '93, shortly before Magic was first released, when Peter Atkinson told me he wanted an expansion for Magic as soon as possible. Several future versions of Magic were already in the works, including Ice Age and Menagerie, published as Mirage. Coming up with 100 new cards just to add to the environment was scary. They couldn't be playtested as completely, and once printed they might fragment players into factions who favored some expansions over others. After all, this differed from an expansion to a traditional board game, which you didn't play with if you didn't like. If your friend had a deck with Arabian Nights cards, did you have to accept it? The solution was to give the expansion its own card back. This way, if the players didn't want to play with or against Arabian Nights cards, they could easily moderate their environment without it looking like we were forcing extra cards into the game. They would look more optional, like expansions for table games were. That way, we could also somewhat guard against a less play-tested set hurting the overall game environment. Arabian Nights would sink or swim on its own merits rather than riding the Gathering's coattails. The problem of mixing card backs in the same deck didn't strike me as being too problematic. I did want to make it so that your opponent didn't necessarily know you were drawing a spell on your turn, so I wanted to have some Arabian Nights basic lands printed. This solution also allowed me to be more adventurous in creating mechanics and themes. After all, this expansion was a separate product. If it didn't work, players wouldn't play it, and we could try again with a different expansion. So, Richard's words here really resonate with me, and it shows his foresight and intuitive understanding of game design. His concerns of cards being unable to be playtested fully, and game pieces growing in complexity as the design space shrinks, are issues that still show up to damage the game's health even today. His concerns were valid, and viewing the set from these concerns does shed some light on some of the designs. City in a Bottle, for instance, was the first set expansion hoser, and its original purpose was to instill agency into the player base by giving them a tool that would allow them to avoid playing against Arabian Nights cards. It's also the only card to reference Ramadan, Sandman number 50, which was the initial inspiration for the set. It's safe to say the solution wasn't ideal, which is why it seems to fade into obscurity within a few expansions. The last expansion to feature a set hoser that I know of was Homelands, which was released in October of 1995. But we all know what happened in the card back debate. Magic cards to this day still use the original card back and probably always will. I do agree it was probably the right decision, but it was not a decision without cost. Here's what Garfield has to say on the subject. As Arabian Nights printing drew nigh, there was more and more agitation over the decision to give it a different card back. The players were giving feedback on the idea, and by and large, hated it. I weighed all of my logical reasons for wanting a different card back, primarily the collapse of the game into complexity, and the strong arming of players into buying cards they might not want, against my gut feeling that they were right and there really should be only one card back. I was told by many that players could moderate the game themselves by using the Arabian Nights expansion symbol, something I considered but wasn't wild about because the symbol was so subtle. I remember at the last minute talking with Peter Adkinson on the phone, with him telling me he would go with whatever I wanted. I decided to leave the card backs the same, and the future of Magic was set. Though I think the single card back was the correct way to go, the issues I worried about were real and weren't solved until much later. The primary solution was the standard format, which rotates out cards every 2 years. This keeps the complexity from going too large for both players and designers, and also eventually kills expansions that a player doesn't like for whatever reason. That reminds me of some of the more broken cards from Arabian Nights, so let's pull a Shahrazad and talk about those. And there's no better place to start than the fabled Power 10, Library of Alexandria. Library of Alexandria is on its face a very interesting and flavorful card. I think it does a fantastic job of showcasing what it's going for. Libraries are a place to gain knowledge and understanding. They provide the tools necessary to grow and develop. This is not unlike the action of drawing a card. In Skaff Elias's article, Better Late Than Never, he talks about some of the cards of questionable power level, and first and foremost is Library of Alexandria. Interestingly, Library of Alexandria was one of the cards that did receive a nerf during development. According to Skaff, the card originally let you draw a card if you had a low number of cards in hand. Skaff couldn't recall if it was 0 or 1 card, but to be fair to Skaff, this article was published in 2002, almost 10 years after the card was released. But he did remember arguing about the card, and they eventually compromised on the card, leading to its released version. Draw a card only if you have 7 in hand. Skaff also brought up Ruck Egg as being too powerful, but I don't think they were considering the ambiguity of the wording, because he only mentions it costing a mana or 2 less, and the card shipped with ambiguous wording. Ali from Cairo was also considered to be especially powerful, but given time, that would prove to not really be true. Certainly, if you were unprepared for it, you would just lose the game, but it has no protection or evasion, and it dies to removal quite easily. But these were the only cards Skaff mentioned in his article, so I'll read his final thoughts on the subject. All in all, it's pretty surprising how good the set turned out to be, given the lack of playtest and development. Richard's instantaneous, virtually solo vision was original, flavorful, and powerful, and despite the hurried schedule, had fewer broken cards than some of the professionally developed sets to follow. And Skaff is right. There are a few powerful cards in the set, and it's far from perfect, but I do think that it has a lot of fun and variety within its card pool. As Mark Rosewater would later say in his article, it happened in one night, as he compares Magic to movies and discusses the Great Train Robbery from 1903, innovation is enough. It's really hard to appreciate historical innovations, because to us they are common. But I think to really appreciate Arabian Nights, you have to look back to the time before and consider the circumstances around it all. Perhaps we'll learn about the more technical side of Arabian Nights development, and I'll explain why the light and dark cards even exist. But that, dear listener, is a story for another time. Hey, thanks for watching. You're a really cool person. I appreciate it. I would love to hear what you have to say on the subject, so if you want to leave a comment, otherwise subscribe if you would like. Either way, thank you very much. As